Today we're working on lesson 8.2, properties of multiplication. There's a vocabulary term right at the top of your paper, reciprocal, if you've never heard of that. And it's a number that when multiplied by the original number results in 1, multiplying 1. And you're going to flip a fraction upside down to get a reciprocal. So if I have 3/4, the reciprocal of 3/4 is 4/3. I just take this number and I flip it upside down and we call that a reciprocal. Or 1/2, the reciprocal is 2/1. All right, so just take that fraction, flip it upside down, we call that a reciprocal. On your paper, and reciprocals are really important for what we're doing in mathematics. On your paper, you have a 2/3 times 3/2 equals. And according to what we did in section 8.1, we know that when we multiply a fraction times a fraction, these two are reciprocals, right? 2/3 flipped upside down is 3/2. We know when we multiply fractions, we take the numerator times the numerator. 2 times 3 is 6. We take the denominator times the denominator. 3 times 2 is 6. And 6/6 is the same as 1. It's saying we have 6 pieces out of a pie that's been broken up into 6 slices, right? So 2/3 times 3/2 equals 6/6 equals 1. So when you multiply a number by its reciprocal, you always get the number 1. I'll just draw this little table that you have on yours. So you got a table. The second one is 4/5 times 5/4. Again, reciprocal, take 4/5, flip that upside down. What do you get? 5/4. 4 times 5 for your multiplying your numerators is 20. 5 times 4 for your denominators is 20. And 20 divided by 20 is equal to 1. So anytime you multiply a number by its reciprocal, you get 1. That's going to be really useful when we get into solving algebraic equations with fractions. All right. And the last one is 6 times 1/6. These are actually reciprocals of each other. They don't look like it, right? They don't look like a fraction flipped upside down. But 6 and 1/6 are actually reciprocals of each other. Because when we write 6 as a fraction, we write it as 6/1, right? And what's the reciprocal of 6/1? We'll flip it upside down, 1/6. So 6 times 1/6 is the same as 6/1 times 1/6 is equal to 6/6 is equal to 1. So anytime you have a whole number, if you put the number 1 over it, we call that the reciprocal. So 6 times 1/6 is going to be 1. 7 times 1/7 is going to be 7. I'm sorry, it's going to be 1. Let's see, 112 times 1/112 is equal to 1. So just to find the reciprocal, take the number, put 1 over it, leave that as a denominator, and you've got your reciprocal. Okay, that's going to be important going forward. Boy, we use that all the time in algebra. All right, next up we've got some properties. I'm not going to write them all on the board here. And a lot of these properties you're familiar with. We're just going to apply them to fractions now. So there's 6 properties. You might want to outline them, underline them or something on your little diagram here, right? So the first one is the commutative property, which just means you can reorder anything. So like 4 times 5 is the same as 5 times 4, right? You could flip this over, that's the commutative property. And with fractions, it just means like 1/2 times 3/4 is the same as 3/4 times 1/2. We can just flip these two around. That's the commutative property multiplication. You can just flip things around, no big deal. The second one is the associative property. That's where you're just moving around some parentheses. So if I had 1/4 times 3/4 in parentheses, or sorry, 1/2 times 3/4 times 2/3, I can rearrange this to be 1/2 times 3/4 times 2/3. So we're just moving these parentheses. We can do that, right? That's the associative property. To just regroup things. You can only do it if you have all multiplication or all addition, but you can't do it if you have multiplication and addition, then it's something different. Next one is the identity property, which is just anything times 1 is equal to 1. So it works for fractions too. 3/4 times 1 is 3/4. 2/5 times 1 is 2/5. So identity property is just anything times the number 1 is going to be equal to itself. Similarly, the zero property of multiplication just says anytime you multiply times 0, you get 0. So again, 3/4 times 0 is 0. 1/2 times 0 is 0. Multiply by 0, you get 0. Then we've got the inverse property of multiplication. Now this is a new one for you, and this is where we use the inverse. So the inverse property of multiplication states that the product of two reciprocals or multiplicative inverses is 1. Multiplicative inverse just means the opposite, which means reciprocal. So again, just what we did on the top of the page, 1/2 times 2 over 1 is going to be equal to, 1/2 times 2 over 1 is going to be equal to 2 over 2 is equal to 1. So anytime you take a number times its reciprocal, you get 1. That's the inverse property of multiplication. 3/4 times 4/3 is equal to 1, right? 3/4, flip it upside down, get its reciprocal, multiply, you get 1. So that's the inverse property of multiplication. We kind of did that at the top of the page. And then the last rule here is the distributive property, which again, we know how to do this. If we had 3 times 2 plus 4, that'd be the same as distributing this 3, and we can make this 3 times 2 plus 3 times 4. We distribute the 3 into those two numbers, which is 6 plus 12, which is 18. That's the distributive property with just whole numbers. We can do distributive property with fractions. Here, in fact, let's just change it so it's all ones. All right, so 1/3 times 1/2 plus 1/4. We can distribute that 1/3 and change this problem into 1/3 times 1/2 plus 1/3 times 1/4. So we can distribute that 1/3 times 1/2 and 1/3 times 1/4. So very similar to what we've done in the past. Okay, so those are the 6 rules we're going to use, 6 properties of multiplication we're going to use in this section. And I've got some examples on the bottom. Let's just check them out. So the first one says 0 times 7 over 10. And it says find the answer, compute it, and then name the property of multiplication used. Well, 0 times 7/10. Anytime you multiply times 0 is 0. And the rule we're using for that one is the 0 property. So on your paper, you should put the answer and then put the property that we used. Give me a marker. So your paper looks something like this, right? You got a table on it. The next one is 5/9 times 9/5. So we're taking a number, we're multiplying by its reciprocal, where we flipped it upside down. 5 times 9 is 45. 9 times 5 is 45. 45 divided by 45 is 1. So anytime you take a number, multiply by its reciprocal, you get 1. And we call that the inverse property of multiplication. I didn't write of multiplication here, but this is the 0 property of multiplication. Where am I getting that from? So when you're doing your homework, just be looking at this chart. Boom, right there is the inverse property of multiplication. Next up, we've got 2/3 times 1/4 plus 1/2. Now, I know you all can do this just using order of operations. I'm sure you could add these two together and then multiply. But let's do it, let's use the distributive property on this one. So I'll put that down on the bottom right now. Distributive property. And this one's actually easier to solve if you use the distributive property. At least I think it's easier. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna distribute this 2/3, because we got multiplication, we got addition there. We're gonna make this 2/3 times 1/4 plus 2/3 times 1/2. And now when we multiply 2/3 times 1/4, we can divide both the top and the bottom by 2, which makes our life a lot easier. So this becomes 1/3 times 1/2, which gives us 1/6. And over here, we've got a 2 on the top and the bottom. Let's not reduce that one. You'll see why in a second. 2 times 1 is 2. 3 times 2 is 6. And we end up with 1/6 plus 2/6, which is 3/6, which is equal to 1/2. So I use the distributive property to distribute this 2/3 into those numbers. So I just did 2/3 times 1/4, 2/3 times 1/2. And on this one, I reduced it because I knew it would give me 6 for a denominator. You probably wouldn't know that when you're doing these in your homework. And then over here, I wanted to get a 6 as a denominator, so I just left it alone. I didn't reduce it, even though I could have, because I wanted to have 6s on the bottoms. Otherwise, I would have had 1 6 plus 1/3. Then I had to find a common denominator. But anyway, that's the distributive property. Next up, we've got 1/4 times 2/3 times 4/1. You could do this using order of operations, 1/4 times 2/3, and then multiply it. But if you look, there's something kind of nice about this one. We've got 1/4 and 4/1. Those are inverses of each other. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the commutative property, which says I can rearrange these in any way I want as long as they're all multiplication. Also can do it if they're all addition. But I'm going to rearrange this. And now I get 1/4 times, we can use the associative property too, I suppose. 1/4 times 4/1 is 1, because those are inverses, times 2/3. And then 1 times 2/3, that's the identity property, anything times 1. And we end up with 2/3 on this one. So I actually used a couple properties on this one. First, I used the commutative property, which says I can rearrange things. Commutative. Which meant I could rearrange these any way I wanted. I used the associative property to group those together, although I ordered operations, I didn't really need to do that. And then once I multiplied this, I used the inverse property, right? Inverse property, which said that anytime you take a number times its inverse, you get 1. And then 1 times 2/3, I use the identity property. Identity property, which says anything times 1 is going to be itself. So I used 3 properties just to solve that one problem, but it made it a lot easier than trying to do 1/4 times 2/3. I had to find a common denominator, or no, I went for multiplication, but I would have gotten 2/12, then 2/12 times 4/1. A lot easier by just, hey, identity property, or inverse property, and work through it. Okay, next one. Losing my train of thought as I'm talking. 7/31 times 1. Anytime you multiply by 1, you get itself. We call that the identity property. And then the last one, 1/2 times 1/5 times 5. All right, well, I could just do order of operations. I could solve inside the parentheses and multiply by 5. But if you look, 1/5 and 5, those are inverses of each other, because this is technically 5/1. So I'm going to use the associative property to make this 1/2 times 1/5 times 5. That's the associative property. And then once I have this, I know that 1/5 times 5 is going to be inverses, which makes that 1. 1/5 times 5/1 is 1. And then 1/2 times 1 is 1/2. So again, I used 3 properties on this one. First, I use the associative property. I use the associative property to rearrange it so I could get my inverses together. Then I use the inverse property. And then once I had my inverses, I got a 1, which then was the identity property. It's going to be a lot to fit in the little square that I gave you. But using those properties help you to solve these problems much faster than if you were just trying to use order of operations. All right, the homework is a little bit easier than what I did here. Generally, they give you some equations. They just ask what property was used. But let me know if you need any help.